Okay, so this is Biology Form 5, Chapter 11, Inheritance, Perwarisan. So we have 4 subtopics in this chapter. Okay, but today we will focus on the first subtopic 11.1 Monohybrid Inheritance. So definitions of Monohybrid Cross. What is Monohybrid Inheritance? Okay, Pewarisan Monohybrid. This monohybrid inheritance involves inheritance of one characteristic and contrasting trait controlled by a gene. Okay, pewarisan satu ciri dengan dua sifat yang berbeza, okay, ataupun sifat yang berbeza yang dikawal oleh gene. Meaning, gene is the one who control the inheritance of a characteristic. Okay, so beza di antara karakteristik dengan traits. Karakteristik ciri, traits itu sifat. For example, characteristics is like the color of the seed. Okay, and the traits, sifat itu adalah sama ada dia mungkin the color of the seed is green, yellow, begitu. Okay, so itu beza karakteristik dengan traits. So here, this is Gregor Mendel. This is scientist, the first person who scientifically explained the principles of inheritance. Okay, so Mendel is known as father of modern genetics. So Mendel experiment. Mendel figured that pea plant, Pisum sativum, possess 7 different characteristics. So look at this figure 11.1. Dia guna pea plant, okay, pea plant dalam dia punya eksperimen, okay, because pea plant have 7 different characteristics. So the first one, for example, seed shape. Seed shape characteristic, traits dia can be round or constricted. Round itu dominant traits and recessive trait dia adalah constricted, dia punya seed shape. Second one, seed color can be yellow, dominant, green, recessive. Pod shape, inflated, dominant, constricted, recessive. Pod color, green dominant, yellow recessive. Flower color, purple dominant, white recessive. Flower position, axial dominant, terminal recessive. Plant height, tall dominant, and dwarf or short is recessive. Okay, so pea plant have contrasting traits. Dia mempunyai sifat yang berbeza. For example, seed shape dia can be round, can be constricted. So that's why dia guna pea plant, sebab dia punya traits itu obvious, easy to identify. Okay, Mendel suggested in his theory that a characteristic in a parent plant is passed down to its next generation through male gametes and female gametes. Okay, so this shows that the nucleus of male and female carries the genetic material of the inherited characteristic. So this inheritance factor is known as gene. So ingat, gene yang kawal pewarisan satu ciri itu kepada offspring. Okay, from parental to offspring. So kita parental gametes, dia carry the genetic material. Okay, the genetic material iaitu gene untuk certain characteristic. Okay, so in monohybrid inheritance experiment, monohybrid, dia fokus kepada pewarisan satu ciri sahaja. Monohybrid inheritance mean pewarisan satu ciri. Mendel used purebred pea plant as the parental generation. The purebred di sini dia obtain melalui self-cross. Self-cross, dia self-cross the same plant or yang mempunyai similar traits. Okay, so self-cross of the purebred tall pea plant will produce only tall offspring. Okay, self-cross. Ini maksud dia self-cross. Dia cross dengan dirinya sendiri. Maksud satu tumbuhan cross dengan satu tumbuhan itu sendiri. Tumbuhan itu sendiri, so kita produce the same lah. Kalau dia tall, so all the offspring also tall. Okay? In the dominance principle, Mendel explained that in a pea plant with a pair of contrasting traits, each trait is determined by dominant inheritance factor. And another contrasting trait is determined by recessive inheritance factor. Maksudnya akan ada yang dominant, akan ada yang recessive. Okay, so dominant itu yang menang. Dominant inheritance factor will suppress the effect of the recessive inheritance factor. So recessive traits, sifat yang recessive itu will not be visible although dia punya factor itu exist together with the dominant inheritance factor. Okay, for example di sini, for example seed shape, dominant itu round, okay, constricted itu recessive. So yang kita boleh nampak, okay, yang trait yang kita boleh nampak, observe adalah round seeds sahaja. Sebab ini yang dominant. Okay, so kita akan teruskan dalam monohybrid cross carried out by Mendel. We continue with your presentation, student presentation. Okay, kita persilakan yang pertama.
In the monohybrid inheritance experiment, Mendel used purebred pea plants as the parental generation to study the inheritance of pea plant traits. So Mendel conducted an experiment to study about the inheritance of pea plant traits. Purebred pea plants are produced through self-cross plant which have similar traits to that of its parent plant in terms of genetic content. Therefore, self-cross of purebred tall pea plants produce only tall offsprings. So purebred pea plants are used in the experiment and they are produced through self-cross plant and they have similar traits to its parent plant. In the dominance principle, Mendel explained that in a pea plant with a pair of contrasting traits, its trait is determined by a dominant inheritance factor, whereas another contrasting trait is determined by a recessive inheritance factor. So, based on the dominance principle, the pea plant has two contrasting traits, dua sifat yang bertentangan, which is determined by the dominant inheritance factor and the recessive inheritance factor. The dominant inheritance factor suppresses the effect of the recessive inheritance factor. Hence, the recessive trait is not visible, although its inheritance factor exists together with the dominant inheritance factor in a pea plant. So, only the dominant trait is visible, the recessive trait is not visible. So, this is the monohybrid cross carried out by Mendel. So, the key, the capital T is the dominant allele for tall, and the small t is the recessive allele for short. So Mendel crossed a purebred tall pea plant with a purebred dwarf pea plant. So this is the tall and dwarf plants, and you can see here the genotype. This one is both capital T and this one is both small t. The cross product between the two purebred plants was the F1 generation, or the first filial generation, which consisted of only tall pea plants. Tall pea plants with the genotype is big T and small t. This shows that the tall trait, big T, is dominant, whereas the dwarf trait, small t, is recessive. So here, first filial generation, the genotype is all capital T, small t, and the phenotype is all tall. Mendel then crossed the F1 generation by self-pollination, and the ratio of tall plant to dwarf plant in the F2 generation was 3:1. So in the second generation, F2, the genotype is both capital T, small t, and both small t. And the phenotype is tall to dwarf is 3:1.
Terms related to inheritance. There are a few important genetic terms that you have to understand before you can continue to learn more about inheritance. So first is genes and alleles. A gene is the basic unit of inheritance which consists of a DNA segment located on a specific locus of a chromosome. A gene controls a specific characteristic of an organism. An allele is an alternative form of a gene for a specific trait that is located on the same locus of a pair of homologous chromosome. So, kalau mau tahu yang lebih simple, genes determine the characteristics. Contohnya height, and alleles is a specific form of a gene. Contohnya tall or dwarf. In figure 11.3, each gene is located on the same locus of a pair of homologous chromosomes. Next, we'll assume that this genes over here controls a height characteristic. So this gene will be represented by an allele. Yang allele 2 is the capital and lowercase letters. Capital letter T controls the tall traits, whereas the lowercase letter t controls the dwarf traits. Next is the phenotypes and genotypes. Phenotypes is the observable characteristic of an organism. For example, dia punya height. We can see whether the organism is tall or dwarf. After that, genotype. Genotype is the genetic composition of an organism that cannot be seen. So, the genotype is the combination of two alleles, one from female parent and one from male parent. For example, both capital letter T are combined, or one is a capital letter T combined with a lowercase letter t. These are genotypes for tall. There is also when both lowercase letter t's are combined, which is a genotype and for dwarf. Next is the characteristic and traits. Characteristic is a heritable feature such as height, eye color, blood group, and presence of dimples. Each characteristic is a feature of an organism. A trait is a variation of a specific characteristic. Each inherited characteristic consists of a specific trait. So, for example of characteristic is color, and the specific trait is red or white. Another example of characteristic is height, and the specific trait is tall or dwarf.
Okay, for dominant alleles and recessive alleles. Dominant allele is an allele which always shows its trait when it is present and suppresses the effect of recessive allele. It is represented by a capital letter, for example B. Okay, for recessive allele. Recessive allele is an allele which shows its trait when both alleles are recessive allele. The effect of recessive allele is suppressed by the presence of dominant allele. It is represented by a small letter, for example a small letter B. Okay, for dominant traits and recessive traits. Dominant trait is expressed when both alleles are dominant alleles, or one dominant allele is paired with a recessive allele. For example, a capital letter of double B, or a capital letter of B and a small letter of B. For recessive trait is expressed if a recessive allele is paired with another recessive allele. For example, a double small letter B. Fun fact, in 2019, Malaysian Agricultural Research and Development Institute (MARDI) had successfully produced MR12H, the first hybrid paddy variety which could increase paddy yield per hectare by up to 20%.
Homozygotes and heterozygotes. Homozygotes, both alleles at loci of a pair of homologous chromosomes are the same. For example, BB in capital letter or BB small letter. Heterozygotes, alleles at loci of a pair of homologous chromosomes are different. For example, B capital letter and B small letter. Next, parental generations and filial generations. Parental generations refers to the first generation of two individuals which are mated to predict or analyze genotypes of their offsprings, while filial generations refers to a successive generation as a result of mating between individuals or purebred parental generation. Next, purebreds and hybrids. Purebred refers to individual which carries two identical alleles for a trait. Self-cross always produces offsprings with the same characteristic in every generation, while hybrid is the product of mating between two purebred varieties.
Figure 11.4 Relationship among a few important terms in genetics. There are two types of parental generation, which is dominant purebred and recessive purebred. For dominant purebred, both alleles are dominant or double B capital letter. Therefore, the dominant trait for flower color characteristic, which is purple, is expressed. Both alleles are the same, therefore the genotype is called homozygous dominant. For recessive purebred, both alleles are recessive or double B small letter. Therefore, the recessive trait for flower color characteristic, which is white, is expressed. Both alleles are the same. Therefore, the genotype is called homozygous recessive. Then, hybrid produced from mating of two purebred plants. This generation is called the first filial generation, and it consists of both dominant allele and recessive allele, which is B capital letter and B small letter. Therefore, the dominant trait for flower color purple is expressed. Recessive trait is not observed because it's suppressed by the dominant trait. Both alleles are different. Therefore, the genotype is called heterozygote. So di sini, how can we explain inheritance of flower color in figure 11.4 in a systematic and scientific manner? So, if allele for the dominant purple trait is labeled B, capital letter, then the allele for recessive white trait is labeled B, small letter. Jadi dominant purple dia kena label B, capital letter, huruf besar, dan recessive white trait dia kena label B, huruf kecil. Therefore, each purebred parent has two identical allele, either double B capital letter for purple flower or double B for small letter for white flower. During formation of gametes, homologous chromosomes separate during meiosis and produce gametes that carry one B capital letter allele from purple flower and one B small letter allele from white flower. So, time formation of gametes, homologous chromosome dia terpisah time meiosis dan akan menghasilkan gametes yang membawa satu B capital letter dari purple flower dan satu B huruf kecil dari white flower. Fertilization between a gamete which carries B capital letter and a gamete which carries B small letter alleles produce offspring with genotype BB capital and small letter in the first filial generation. So, in the first filial generation, offspring yang kena produce adalah genotype BB. Big letter for B and small letter. Since B allele capital letter is dominant, the BB capital letter and small letter genotype combination expresses only phenotype with purple flower. Jadi dia hanya menghasilkan bunga warna purple. The effect of recessive allele is suppressed by the presence of the dominant allele. If the first filial generation is self-crossed, the second filial generation will have offspring with double B capital letter, BB capital and small letter, and double B small letter genotypes. Double B capital letter and BB capital and small letter genotype express phenotype with purple flower, whereas double B small letter genotype expresses phenotype with white flower. The trait that is not observed in the first filial generation, which is white flower color, appears in the second filial generation. The above explanation for inheritance of flower color can be explained in the form of a schematic diagram of inheritance in figure 11.5.
Okay, figure 11.5, monohybrid schematic diagram for flower color characteristic. Okay, first kita pergi di first part untuk ni diagram, which is the cross of parental generation between purebred purple flower and purebred white flower. Okay, parental phenotype. Phenotype kita tahu dia sebagai karakteristik. So, untuk purebred purple flower, we can observe that it is purple in color. And for the purebred white flower, we can observe that it is a white in color. Parental genotype. Genotype kita tahu dia sebagai genetic composition. So, untuk purebred purple flower, the genotype is 2 big B. And for the purebred white flower, the genotype is 2 small b. Next, the process of meiosis occurs. From the diagram, only one gamete produced. This is because during meiosis, in anaphase 1, homologous chromosome will separate from each other and move to different poles, so they take the alleles along with them, and at the end of meiosis, each daughter cell or gamete form has only one allele. Similarly, for the purebred white flower, the two alleles small b separate from each other during meiosis as the homologous chromosome separate, and so each gamete of the daughter plant will carry one allele small b. Okay, so dari diagram, the gamete from the purebred purple flower contains big B, and the gamete from the purebred white flower contains small b. So, bila big B gamete dan small b gamete fuse together, dia akan produce an offspring big B and small b, which is the F1 genotype. So, kita tahu di sini phenotype untuk F1 plants are all the flowers are purple, sebab purple trait is dominant, or we can say stronger compared to white trait. Okay, so kita pergi next part, which is the self-crossed F1 generation. Okay, so the F1 phenotype, kita sudah tahu dari yang tadi, is that all the flowers are purple and they have the genotype of big T and small t. Next is meiosis. Macam yang tadi juga, yang macam yang first part, yang second part pun berlaku proses yang sama juga. Tapi ini kali bukan satu saja gamete yang terhasil, tetapi dua sudah gamete yang akan terhasil. Okay, in meiosis, homologous chromosomes separate from one another and they will cause alleles to separate from one another and move to different poles and into different cells, so the first gamete will have the allele big T and the second gamete will have the allele small t. Okay, kalau kita rujuk diagram, kita nampak tuh garis-garis hijau ataupun kita panggil yang possibility untuk tuh F2 genotype. So the final genotype combined is 1 double big B, 2 big B and small b, and 1 double small b. So from here we will know that the ratio of the F2 phenotype would be 3 purple and 1 white. Based on the fertilization diagram in figure 11.5 di slide yang tadi, for monohybrid inheritance, the genotypic ratio in F2 generation is 1 double big B, 2 big B, and 1 small b, and 1 double small b yang kita sudah dapat tadi. Whereas the phenotypic ratio in F2 generation is 3 purple, 1 white. Punnett square can also be used to predict the ratios and probabilities of genotype and phenotype in the offsprings produced. Boxes in the Punnett square represent different allelic combinations of zygote or offsprings that are produced. Okay, figure 11.6 Monohybrid Cross using Punnett square. Okay, parental generation. Di sini ada purebred purple flower and purebred white flower. These two flowers mate together, producing the first filial generation, which is a purple flower but with the genotype of big B and small b, which is the mix of both flowers. Then process of fertilization occurs, producing the second filial generation, which is the offspring of the first filial generation. Untuk second filial generation ataupun F2 generation, kita tahu yang ada banyak possibility untuk F2 genotype. So, selain daripada kita guna schematic diagram, kita juga boleh guna Punnett square to know the possibilities and ratio of genotype and phenotype in the offsprings produced. So, di sini sama aja macam fertilization diagram di figure 11.5. Genotypic ratio di F2 generation dia 1 double big B, 2 big B and small b, and 1 double small b. Dan phenotypic ratio dia 3 purple and 1 white.
Subtopic 11.1 Mendel's first law. There is one man named Mendel who introduced Mendel's first law or law of segregation. Bukan nih, terlampau simple. Before I start this presentation, kamu perasan ada gambar muka saya sana? Saya sengaja taruh muka saya sana. Teacher gue cakap ikut keselesan kamu, so saya taruh gambar sebab saya malu raka muka handsome saya. Hehehe. Okay, back to the topic. This law stated that a characteristic of an organism is controlled by a pair of alleles and only one of the allelic pair is inherited in the gamete. The characteristic of the next generation was inherited from the parent by a genetic factor or known as gene. For example, the characteristic of papaya inherited from the mother papaya, not from the mama rambutan. Like your face have the beauty of your mom, because you have the gene of your mother. Hehe. Next, each character of diploid organism is determined by a pair of alleles. After that, the alleles will segregate via meiosis, and only one allele from the pair is found in a single gamete. During fertilization, a zygote form possesses two alleles for a specific characteristic. Why two? Because a zygote was formed from two cells and each cell have one allele. Lastly, the fertilization is random. Yeah, random like random. Like it can be tall plus tall, tall plus short, short plus tall, or short. There are three types of genotypic combination. The first one is homozygous dominant, which is the diploid organism has the same dominant alleles of the parent's gene. For example, the height of the parents are tall, and the next generation is 100% tall. Next, Homozygous recessive, which is the diploid organism, has the same recessive alleles from the parents. For example, if the parents are short and short, so the next generation will be 100% short. Lastly is the Heterozygous Gynotype, which is a combination of the dominant alleles and recessive alleles. For example, if the parents tall plus short, there will be 50% the next generation will be tall or short. Or if the parents is short plus tall, the result will be also the same. 50% may be tall or short.